Good morning, everyone. It's Gary Pine here from W2. I'm the Chief Product and Marketing Officer for W2. This is the second in a series of webinars relating to the gaming, the gambling, and the betting markets. I'm just going to briefly hand over to Peter. So Peter, at the end of today's session, will also give you details of another webinar that we're running. Without further ado, just to hand over to Peter, our moderator for the day. Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate that, Gary, and thanks to everybody for joining today. I know we're all busy, even if we are in lockdown. So I hope, firstly, I hope everybody's safe and well. It's odd times we live in, but I hope the lockdown's not affecting you too badly. So as Gary said, it's the second of a series of webinars we're looking to do. The first was looking at the very early days, first couple of weeks of how COVID-19 was affecting us. Next week, we're going to run one specifically on Gibraltar with Andy Lyman, the Gambling Commissioner, on it, looking at the challenges they've got. But for this week, we wanted to focus on probably the central point we're all concentrating on at the moment, which is around safer gambling, what it means for the industry, how we're tackling it, what the science tells us behind the issues, and what more needs to be done. So we've tried to cover the globe in this. So we've gone from Australia to the US, and the UK are represented. So especially thank you to Sally for late in the evening, and Keith especially for 6 o'clock in the morning. That's commitment. But as panels go, I think we have to say this one's a bit star-studded, which is why the attendee level's so high. I think nothing to do with my ramblings. But rather than sort of me introduce them, I'll probably go one by one, just do a quick introduction on yourself, who you are, where you fit. I'll start with the early riser for today, and that's you, Keith. What about yourself?
No, thank you, Peter. Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keith Whyte. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council on Problem Gambling in the United States, and I've been working on gambling policy now for almost 25 years here on the national level.
Yeah. Great. Thanks for that. I think we'll cover it later on, but you've been ploughing a pretty lonely furrow at times over those 25 years, although I think the sports betting changes has changed the focus on that. But next up, we'll come further afield to the far-flung Australia and Dr. Sally Gainsbury. Sally, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm Associate Professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and I'm co-director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic. So we're Australia's only treatment clinic that's affiliated with a university. And the research I lead looks at understanding the psychology of gambling with the aim of developing prevention and harm minimisation resources and policies, with a strong focus on the impact of technology, both for potentially increasing risks and how we can mitigate these through technology solutions.
That's great. Thanks for that. And I think especially in an age where we're all quite rightly focusing on evidence-based outcomes, I really appreciate the research view. I don't think we often hear enough of it. And for all those attending today, we'll be sending out a link after this with some link-ups to the work Sally and her colleagues have done. And we'll cover that later on in the event. So for those in the UK, it seems quite frankly ridiculous to ask my next two guests to introduce themselves, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Brigid, I'll come to you first. So tell us a bit about yourself and where you fit in.
Yes, so I'm Brigid Simmonds. I'm the chairman of the newly formed Betting and Gaming Council. We launched in November last year. We represent over 90% of the industry in the UK. So we cover casinos, bingo, remote gaming, and also obviously betting shops.
All right, fantastic. And I think it's interesting, and we'll cover it later on, about how the industry is coming together to represent itself. And finally, Richard. So Richard, I know you've been away from the industry for a very short period of time. So for any new joiners to the gambling sector, especially in the UK, just give us a brief overview of yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Richard Flint. So I really come from an operator's point of view. I was essentially chief executive of Sky Bet from around 2006 to around 2018, and we grew from a pretty small player to one of the biggest in the UK market. And really, over that time, we had a very recreational customer base who primarily bet on sports to make it more exciting for them. And over time, perhaps unsurprisingly, the issues of problem gambling, responsible gambling, and the politics and regulation around that became an ever greater theme, and was really my main focus in the last few years. At the moment, I'm out of the industry, but if the merger between Flutter and Styles go together, then I'll be joining the board as a non-exec of the combined group.
So we haven't heard the last of you yet then. So I think, yeah, I think even up to recently, so the industry had an approach which was almost avoiding sort of the issues, and especially when it came to the media and political perceptions and public perceptions. And I think said this before, but for a while, I think it almost seemed like you were one of the very few C-levels willing to stand up and tackle the issues head on. So I'm really keen to get both yours and Brigid's view on how the industry puts itself forward and what we have to do in this. And we'll come to that shortly. And for anybody that doesn't know me and the team I work with at W2, so I've worked for 12, 13 years in the identity space around data and technology, how they align specifically for sort of like KYC and compliance. And here at W2, we're simply a single gateway, sort of focusing on compliance, intelligence, customer intelligence solutions, with a heavy focus, obviously, of myself. So that's the panel. So let's kick off. I think I want to start with, and I don't want to be over dramatic about it because COVID-19 does that to all of us, but I think the industry probably does stand at a bit of a crossroads, specifically here in the UK, the sort of tsunami globally of regulatory pressures, an increased and laser-like focus on the sector from the media, the politicians and the public, and probably even more so than it's been in the past. And then along comes COVID-19 to sort of truly test the adaptability and sustainability of where we work. But most of that is reflected here in the UK, which seems a good barometer for what's likely to happen elsewhere. Sort of a regulator baring its teeth, increasingly willing to act in the form of larger fines, suspensions, etc., and putting the customer at the heart of the industry. And that's the part we want to concentrate on today. So safer gambling, problem gambling, responsible gambling, whatever term you want to use on that, especially with sports shut down, the industry's customers confined at home. How are we responding to it? And is that going to be vital going forward, not just for the health of the industry, but for the well-being of the customers? And the UK has got an extra added focus with the Gambling Act under review. And so I think what we do over the next sort of couple of months is going to define potentially the next decade. But I want to start first with with Sally. And I think the industry recognises and promotes the fact now that we need to be more evidence-based. There's working groups, committees, sort of recognition that we need to have some facts behind the assumptions. So can I ask Sally, from your perspective, give us a little view on sort of academia, the research, what you look at, how it's changed over the years, and how you and your colleagues deal in this space.
Sure, thank you. I've been working in gambling research since around 2004. So I have seen changes over this period, particularly pleasingly with greater acceptance of the importance of responsible gambling or consumer protection, how it's increasingly referred given the stigma that's associated with the terms like problem gambling and responsible gambling. But this idea that it's no longer just about regulation or regulatory compliance or a demonstration of corporate social responsibility, but a real recognition of real harms that are related to gambling and genuine efforts to make sure that the products are enjoyable and sustainable for as many customers as possible. Part of that change has been a shift towards increasing focus on evidence-based practice. With the evidence that's actually quite important, a move towards expecting greater collaboration between stakeholders, involving the industry and the regulators in the research process while maintaining rigorous research with independence and peer review to ensure that is appropriately conducted, but as well as having ecological validity. And that's been a real shift. So we've gone away from having to rely on lab-based studies with university students to be able to look at large projects of real strategies with methodological rigor due to this cooperation between stakeholders, and then being able to apply these in reasonable ways and with acceptance of those findings and transparency. So I think that's been a really important shift, and hopefully that will continue.
So you are seeing sort of genuine more collaboration than we've seen in the past, generally across the whole stakeholder base?
It's certainly not across everybody. As always, there's going to be a variance in the operators. There are a lot of operators that are genuinely collaborative and are working very hard in this area. And it's really pleasing to see that there's increased competition to have best practice in the area of consumer protection and responsibility. However, there's always operators that are less interested in this or not interested at all, or are turning it on its head and being even predatory, if not persuasive, in some of their offerings. So it's important for the whole industry to recognise that those operators will have a huge impact on both consumer perceptions as well as regulatory actions going forward.
Do you see that as a sort of last point on this? Do you see that as a sort of a black market? Because we often like to focus on the people that aren't taking regulatory things seriously. Do you see any difference in that, or is there still people in the regulated market not taking it seriously enough?
I mean, certainly it can go all ways. And the thing is, with any large company, there's lots of individuals within companies that have different views. So it really, with the consumer protection, it has to be top down. There has to be buy-in throughout the entire organisation. Otherwise, you get a well-intended responsible gambling department and a marketing department that does something completely at odds with that. We do see that a lot, a lack of communication, despite commitments, a lack of communication between departments that ends up with, front page news. So certainly it's easy to lay claim to the black market being responsible for all of the disreputable operations, but it's, as we see from all the fines being handed out and more focused on it, it's not restricted only to the offshore markets. There's real need for the entire industry to continue to press ahead with making sure best practice at all levels of the companies.
Yeah, I think Richard is the sort of C-level operator type background in here. Is that it's got to be a fair comment, hasn't it? It's got to come from the top.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, and it's got to be a cultural thing that goes throughout the whole company. And that, as Sally pointed out there, in a big company, to get cultural change is a hard job. And even if you feel that you are making progress there are still things that happen, normally unwittingly, but sometimes because people aren't fully bought in or fully incentivized throughout the organization to stick to the sort of cultural values that you want to perpetuate. So it is a big job to get a whole organization lined up with something which has been a change for the industry. 10 years ago, to be honest, it wasn't really, and it's in some ways it's a shame to say this, but 10 years ago, people were more focused about growing online businesses and hitting growth targets rather than being responsible. There's been a change in industry over time, and all of us as individual companies have had to change within that, and some have gone further than others.
Yeah. Keith, view from the US on that. I guess it's the same. But do you see any differences in how the US approaches the whole attitude and the area of safer gambling?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Sally's comments are right on, and they're just magnified in the United States, where we have not just 50 sovereign states who run their own gambling policy. We have almost 600 Native American tribes who are dependent sovereigns. They're the equivalent of Gibraltar or Isle of Man, if you will. And then in many states, there's multiple regulators in each state. So yeah, so our I think we have a few leaders in responsible gambling in the United States and a lot of followers. And I would say, just to echo Richard and Sally's point, we judge the industry by the actions of its lowest member, of the least compliant, of the ones that are most resistant to responsible gambling. And having worked in a similar place to Brigid, I was director of research for the American Gambling Association. I know full well how difficult it is for a trade association to corral and harness all its members, especially the members that may not even be, or especially the folks that may not even be members of that body. But it is critical. So, our American Gaming Association has done a good job at talking a lot about social responsibility, but they don't represent all casinos, much less the entire industry. And there's a lot of leakage there. There are a lot of gaps, and in some ways, the companies that are doing really, really well kind of mask the facts, the facts on the ground, and they unfortunately allow some of their peers, some of their competitors, to do little or nothing, and that drags the standard down for everyone. And the industry has to be judged by the actions of some of those folks, if you will. And it makes it really difficult.
Yeah, no, agree with that. I think probably a good point to come to Brigid and the challenges of pulling an industry together. How have you found it since you entered the fray, Brigid?
All trade associations have those sorts of issues, but because we're 90% of the industry, there are not that many companies that are outside our reach. And to be honest, everything that we do, we make absolutely public. And ultimately, we expect the Gambling Commission to come in and to make it a requirement of having a UK licence. I mean, it doesn't happen immediately, but it will happen over a period of time. So when we launched last year, we were quite clear. We were about raising standards. We're a standards body in the UK. We launched with 22 commitments. Immediately, we went into lockdown here. I mean, we've closed every casino, bingo club, betting shop in the country. So the only place that you could go was online. We recognised that there was going to be challenges there, that we wanted to ensure that we were not attracting vulnerable people to take part in gambling activity when they were based at home. So we launched a 10-point plan right from the start. We increased the safer gambling messages. We encouraged people to set deposit limits. We've been intervening much more, and we've been advertising GamStop, which is the self-exclusion scheme, and the national helpline. So, and I think, and we're keeping in touch with both the government and the Gambling Commission and working with them really hard to make sure. No company or no trade associations can say that nothing will ever slip through the gaps. But as an industry, clearly from CEO level down, they were quite clear that they knew they needed to come together and to do more. And at the end of the day, I think we also have to explain to everybody, if you don't, we want to be the best in class and the best in the world, but neither do we want to encourage people to go and gamble on unregulated black market sites around the world. And they are preying on people now to encourage them to gamble, even if our members are not.
Yeah, I think it's, well, I'll pick up on that now. I was going to bring it up later on, but the sort of change of tone from the BGC, I'm assuming, this harks back to some of the stuff Richard was doing about standing up for the sector when being challenged. I'm assuming that's an absolutely deliberate approach. Where did that come from? How's it going? Tell me a bit about that.
It is certainly a deliberate approach. I mean, my background was I ran the British Beer and Pub Association for 10 years. We had exactly the same issues in working with government, big manufacturing industry, pubs that people really should love, but they were closing them left, right and centre because of government policies. The same is true here. We're a big economic powerhouse to the government, but we have to be responsible in industry. And the work that we're doing around high value customers, around advertising technology, around games design, has to look at those who are vulnerable. So I inherited something called the whistle to whistle ban because there was a real concern about advertising on television, particularly advertising around sports betting. Obviously, we've got no sports betting at the moment because there isn't any sport. But the whistle to whistle ban means that you now don't have any advertising 5 minutes or before a live game until 5 minutes after a live game. We've seen an 85% reduction in the last year in television advertising. So if the industry really works together, I think it can create real change.
Be interesting. I'll come to that point sort of around advertising a bit later on because it's one a number of brought up in questions. But I think, Richard, from your perspective, do you see that difference now? Do you see the industry much more aligned with each other than it used to be sort of in the early days of Sky Bet?
Yeah, I mean, when Brigid was talking there, it reminded me of so many discussions over such a long time, and some of the mistakes the industry has made. And I believe in a regulated gambling industry. I believe it should be quite heavily regulated, but should exist because it's a product that millions of people get pleasure out of. And to be honest, actually banning products is very difficult, particularly in an online space. So if you believe in a regulated industry, I think that the industry has to actually have a presence, has a profile, and stand up for itself. There were long periods in the early days where we had debates with quite prominent people in the industry where they said, there's no point in us engaging with media and politicians because we're always going to be on the wrong end of it, and we're always going to be criticized, and no one's going to love us, or even like us. So why do we bother? I think that was a huge mistake for a long period of time. I think we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and be comfortable with how we're running our businesses and what we're doing. And if you are comfortable yourself with that, you need to be willing to stand up and face the general public on Twitter and face the media and talk to politicians about it, and be clear about what mistakes have been made, be clear about what you offer, be proud in what you do, and engage with the public around that. And that was what I decided to do myself, and that is that approach has led to the BGC. And I think for the first time we've now got, for the first time that I can remember, we've now got a an organisation that can both, take better control of its members and also be proud and speak up for what we. So I'm very pleased about that, and also very pleased that another problem that we've had over the last decade is different sectors spending time trying to take chunks out of each other for commercial benefit, which hasn't really helped anyone. So I think we've hopefully got mostly beyond that as well. So I think it's a big step forward, but there's a hell of a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on a couple of points as they're coming in, because we could probably just run this session on the questions that are coming in. But I'll come to you, Brigid, because it was part of that conversation. There's a question from Tony Franklin around how you're measuring your 10-point plan, and are you going to be publishing the data? Now, made a big splash when you put that out there, but could you tell us about your approach?
Yes, I mean, obviously you can't really measure something until we're a bit further down the line. So we will be looking, and it will be very clear. Advertising, for example, will be relatively easy to measure, because there will be other bodies that will pick that up. How we will be tested over the number of interventions we've made, I think will, again, take a little bit of time to see that. But I do a lot of interviews where people come up with a lot of very historic bad practice. I took 5 chief executives in front of the House of Lords Committee into Gambling, who were all absolutely clear that they had made mistakes in the past. I can only look to where we're going in the future. We will do everything we can to measure the changes that we've made. And we're also encouraging, and I think this is important for everybody, we've got a national pandemic. We've got people losing their jobs left, right and centre. We raised £2.6 million for holding a virtual Grand National. And I've got companies all over the place doing everything from encouraging bingo online as chat shows, having free games, and encouraging just social activity, to providing hand sanitizers, using empty casinos to provide food for local people and those who are vulnerable. We're all trying to, and supporting the horse racing industry. I mean, the horse racing industry in this country wouldn't exist, frankly, without the betting and gaming sector. We're talking to them with our chief executives about how we can support them going forward. I think we all have to be part of this, of a national effort, and not look at ourselves just as an individual industry.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think it goes back to Richard's point. The gambling industry, just by the nature of what it does and the perception, is going to get no kudos for doing it. So I think it's a case of being open and transparent. Back to the question about publishing data, because we always got to look at it. They would say that, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Because that's the approach we're going to get. And I think the only way around that is to just become as open and transparent as we possibly can be. On the basis that they'll obviously not please anybody. Keith, from a US perspective, I guess there's no real sort of joined up approach with your 50 states and the challenges you've got around there. From a problem gambling perspective, is it very as disparate as that? No, there's no one set of, apart from yourself, set of guidelines around the whole issue.
Yeah, we are almost the definition now of balkanized. With almost 1,000 different regulatory jurisdictions, it is quite hard, and we can't even get minimum age. There's no consistent minimum age for various forms of gambling in the United States. So we advance without a national regulator. We have to advance voluntary harmonization. So we try and set best practice standards as an NGO and working in partnership with industry and regulators. We try and set best practice standards which operators and vendors can build their products to across any jurisdiction in the United States, and services we can deliver across any jurisdiction. And hopefully we encourage operators and vendors to adopt those, governments to adopt those, because ultimately it makes for a consistent set of consumer protections. We're still far from that project. This is a national council was founded in 1972, so it's a project of almost 5 decades. But that's at least, I think, the only way to get consistent consumer protection, because of course gamblers cross borders, advertising crosses borders, the internet is global, and just to think is you have a consistent set of regulations in one jurisdiction, but it doesn't apply across the hundreds of others is foolhardy.
Don't talk to me about regulatory harmonization. It seems to be going on forever. I've got a question I'll ask each of you. I'll come to Sally first, because it's a question that comes up all the time on issues around safer gambling. Is there a definition, Sally, from your perspective first, Is there a definition of a problem gambler? Is there something we can hang that tag on?
Yeah, so we deal with this in different ways. There is a definition of a gambling disorder. So it's a recognized mental health disorder that's included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health, the fifth version. It's been updated and changed quite considerably over the years. That's by the American Psychiatric Association. It's classified as an addiction similar to substance use. So there are a set of criteria that you can meet, and it requires a diagnostic interview. However, most research or regulatory rhetoric refers to problem gambling, which is not clearly defined. It's vaguely mostly referred to as when there's harm, again, harm not being defined, harm inconsistently to either the person and in some jurisdictions, including harm to others. So it's quite subjective when you start breaking it down to what we define as problem gambling. But essentially, most people are talking about the fact that the individual is gambling to the extent that they're experiencing significant harm. So that means life-altering harm and disruption to many areas of their life. So psychological distress, potentially physical health, but also to finances, relationships, employment and studies, so that the harms are quite broad in that sense. What's interesting is we've had a really good shift, because there was previously a focus really from regulatory only on people who are problem gamblers, which meant that they're having these serious harms, and a recognition of the broader sense of gambling and gambling-related harms to include protections and specific strategies for people who might be at lower or moderate risks of harms, with the aim of preventing the development or exacerbation of problems. So rather than what we would call the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, having things like self-exclusion and treatment for people who have significant harms, there's been a shift towards recognizing the people within gambling who are experiencing some level of harms, potentially not at critical life-altering levels, but still warrant specific consideration and protection. And so this term of a problem gambler is really important to look at. What is the target group? And particularly when we're talking about mechanisms to prevent harms, is this about preventing harms amongst people who already have problems? Is it preventing them from developing in the first place? Is it preventing low or moderate risks of harms? Because identifying that target and what you're really trying to achieve is critical to be able to develop any sort of evaluation of whether strategies are effective.
Yeah, I'll come to the rest of the panel in a second. Do you see that, because the challenge is around identifying, do you see any collaboration across jurisdictions about what that is in your research point of view, what the UK might regard as opposed to Australia or America?
There's some collaboration, but also there's an increased focus on transparency and sharing research. So this is where data and publications are made publicly available so that research teams can build on other projects. There are a number of different systems in place. Some of them are commercial, so they do have a bit of ring fencing around them, but there certainly is a push at various different jurisdictions towards this idea of trying to identify people at specific points in their journey towards potentially developing problem gambling, to be able to intervene at appropriate levels to be able to prevent those serious harms from occurring.
Okay, so Brigid, from a sort of trade body association and UK focus, do we have a definition of problem gambling?
I think Sally has said it all and described it. But one of the things I would say is when I joined the industry, one of the concerns I had is people, when I announced I was going to take this job, sort of whispered behind their backs, so I actually enjoy a flutter and I enjoy a bet on the odd occasion, but they weren't prepared to talk about it openly. And I almost think that the media pressure makes that worse. There is this suggestion that there is something inherently wrong with you wanting to have a bet or a gamble, and yet it's something that's gone on for thousands of years. So I think one of the things we need to do is to talk about it more, and I'm particularly concerned during COVID-19 that you've got a lot of people, quite a lot of people who are on their own in flats, and what we do not want to encourage them with too much time on their hands is to bet or to gamble, all the time or beyond their means, but also that people talk about it more within families. It should be something that is part of a social experience and is not something, just as when your children go off to university, certainly in this country, I think we now as parents talk to them about drinking and how much they should drink and how they should behave. I don't think we're having those conversations about gambling. And I think particularly with mobile phones and generationally, because let's face it, my generation had a very different experience, no experience of mobile phones when any of us were that age. We need to be having those conversations more readily. And perhaps now the time when we're all at home is the time to do that.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think the challenge, I guess, is the same as the questions that are coming in, is around identifying a problem gambling. I think we all accept ideas now of being more open and transparent and all that side of things is absolutely right. But it's trying to nail what a problem gambler is. And I guess from that, we're probably no near having a definitive answer for the industry to work on.
Well, and Peter, just to pick up on Sally and Brigid's points a little bit, we really need rapid research now to evaluate the impacts of COVID on people with gambling problems. And at least in the United States, I'm not aware of much, if any, research capacity focused on looking at these immediate impacts. We know people with gambling problems have massive stress and disadvantage already. Poor physical health, poor mental health, high rates of substance use and abuse. And you add job loss, social isolation, and economic crisis. This could be a perfect storm for people at risk for gambling problems as they shift into unregulated online gambling in many of the states. And we're barely able to assess those impacts now.
Yeah, just a point that's come in. I'll come to Richard on it. It was asked by Dr. Ali has come in, who's obviously interested in this field. Richard, I think a lot of this is around the challenges in the past of the industry's lack of willingness to share data, and I guess some of that's the legal aspect. But I'd certainly back that up, is there was very little appetite to share information. And I guess the questions around advocating responsible gambling and sharing data and being real time is one of the key. I guess that's going to be critical, certainly from an operator's perspective. What are the challenges around that?
Yeah, I think that the industry should be willing to share data. I think it was quite interesting that that the minister in the letter that was published a couple of days ago made a big play on a data request, which I thought was very positive. Actually, I think that's the right way to conduct regulation, to ask for the data and see what it tells you, and the industry will have to comply with that, and rightly so. I think there has been nervousness about sharing data. I don't necessarily think it's well placed. I think it comes from that perspective that the industry is never going to get a fair hearing and data is never going to be reported in the right way. And I have to also say that, and I think quite a few academics in the field, I don't think the people on the panel are in this category, but have I think someone called it evidence policy-based evidence making. That had the sort of perspective that they have and I can't remember, my family, my dad was a scientist, and some academics have such a strong view of what they think should and shouldn't happen, and and use that as a lens to look at any piece of data. And I think the industry, has a perspective that the analysis won't be conducted objectively. And I think it's very important that the industry, there needs to be trust on both sides. Academic community needs to be evidence-based and look at things from an evidence point of view, and the industry needs to supply that data, and both need to come together on that.
Yeah, I think we'd all agree with that. I think if we try to look at the actual sort of the practicalities of it, from your perspective, Sally, do you have a view of what best practice looks like? We talk about a lot of initiatives that are coming on. You've done a lot of research across a number of different parts of this. Do you have a view on what best practice is when it comes to minimizing harm?
It really depends on the product, the environment. There's so many different factors that go into it. Unfortunately, most of the policies and practices at the moment rely on the individual to recognize, so have a level of self-awareness and essentially opt in. So most of the consumer tools that are available, they do rely on individual action to take some sort of, to set themselves a limit or to block themselves or something that requires them to act. There is increasing focus on using data analytics and artificial intelligence to be able to identify and having consumer being identified and interventions from operators directly. But again, the extent to which that's a phone call to check in and still left for the individual to ultimately make their own decisions although hopefully with some sort of prompt or resource. So we really need to shift in terms of looking at what are the individuals at the level of harm, what's the appropriate strategies for people at low risk of harm in terms of encouraging them to use things like deposit limits and normalizing that, because we know from our research that it's about people's perceptions of the tools. So terms like responsible gambling and setting limits, it's quite a turn off for individuals who don't want to be restricted. They want to have fun with their gambling. They don't want to be told what to do. So it's about the phrasing and implementation and thinking about normalizing these activities. Just like everyone puts on a seatbelt, everyone should have a deposit limit that's appropriate for them at their level. And as we start to shift the focus and societal norms towards use of consumer protection tools and seeing these as a play management tool, something to enhance your gambling rather than to restrict you, or that it's only relevant to people with problems and I'm not a degenerate, so I don't have problems. We have these huge stigma and personal biases that exist. So it's about changing the culture, which again is the operators, the staff, the consumers, the regulators, all working together to take this shift towards something that will create a more sustainable gambling. And that includes changes to the products, changes to the venues, changes to the messaging, all in an attempt to change the societal norms. And we see from something like tobacco that this takes decades to occur in many, many different layers of interventions, all nudging people in different directions. So there's no magic bullet, one-off intervention best practice. It's about looking at the entire culture, all the environment and how it's interacting with the individuals in terms of moving towards what I would refer to as sustainable gambling at appropriate levels.
Yeah.
Okay.
Peter, can I just pick a couple of, I think, really, really important points there. I think that I completely agree that the normalization of, responsible gambling, for better of a term, and use of the tools across the entirety, or certainly most of the customer base, needs to happen. I think also the other really important point about, as an operator in the sector, in the early days, we thought, well, it's our job to provide the tools, and the customer can choose whether or not to take them up. Hopefully they will. I think, something I really wrestled with sort of 4 or 5 years ago, shift to sort of a paternalistic approach, where as an operator, you will intervene, you will stop someone spending and stop someone using their account. And that's a huge change. It is, I think, working its way through the industry at the moment. I think it's absolutely right that we do that. And I think the sort of hands-off approach wasn't correct. But actually how you do that, making sure you do it in a genuine way, recognizing that will cost revenue, and that, for some companies, particularly those in different situations, might wrestle with that, and how, the responsibility of making that decision and actually communicating that message to customers in a way that they may not want to receive it is incredibly challenging for operators. And I think this is a whole area that we need to work on and improve on, and recognize the real challenges in doing that, but recognizing also that it has to happen.
I think, Gary, if you put the first poll up, and what I'll do, it's a question that came in overnight, and I'll read it out and we'll go through. I'll start with Keith for this one, but sort of, does the panel now accept that stake limits, spend limits, time limits, affordability checks are inevitable and critical to operating fair and sustainable? It refers to online casino gambling business. I don't know if it's specific to that. But do we accept that these are just things that are coming, or do you think it's something we've got time to review? What's your view on the inevitability of all those things happening?
Well, in the United States, I think that's it's rare that almost any of those measures are in place, and so we're I would say, I personally think they're great ideas, but I don't think there's much support at all amongst our operators for any of those.
Yeah, I guess it's a very different environment out there. Brigid, from an industry here in the UK, do you accept those are inevitable? A bit like the credit card ban, irrespective of the debate around it?
We're definitely going to be having the discussion. I mean, we know there's going to be a review of the Gambling Act. We know that the Gambling Commission have already talked about deposit limits. I think, though, we have to be careful, and we have to look at whether this is going to be a set limit, whether we're going to be having discussions about whether it's based on affordability. And we have to acknowledge the fact that online you have much more information about people than you do about people who go into a shop or into a casino, and it's how you use that information. So we're now doing a lot more work in the UK with banks. I think that's important, so that they share data with us. I've sat next to people who are physically intervening with customers, and who, if they don't respond, they just close the account until they come back to them, or they have a discussion with people about whether they should be setting a deposit limit or whatever. So I think the debate is out there. I think it's a proper debate that we should have. I think it has got to be based on affordability. So I don't think it's necessarily a one size fits all. But I think that is going to be a discussion that we will certainly be having in the UK. And I suspect once we've had it here, that other countries will follow.
Yeah, I think looking at the poll results, 85% said they're inevitable. So I think we're obviously all think they were coming. I think sort of from that point of view, you mentioned banks there and affordability, and I think that's one of the key issues around here, because what does it mean? How do we analyse it? What do we do? Where are we with trying to get a view on that, Brigid? I know there's a lot of research in the UK going on around affordability. You have a lot of collaboration going on. What's your view on affordability?
Well, we've got various groups that we're looking at. So we've just reported back to our Gambling Commission on high value customers. So we've been absolutely clear that if you're under the age of 25, you can't become a high value customer. And we've set in store a whole lot of work in action to review high value customers. We're looking at games design. So are the triggers in a game that you play on a computer or whatever it is, that would encourage people to do more, and we've got various working around that, and we're ensuring we're not encouraging vulnerable people to play more quickly or more often, and that they have to have particular spaces between games. And then the third one, which I think is really interesting, is about advertising technology. So we're trying to work with, and we are working with Facebook, with Google, with the online channels to look at how do we ensure, and we do have age here. I mean, you can't gamble in this country unless you're over the age of 18, and other than the National Lottery. So how do we ensure that our advertisements are not being put forward to people who are underage? And that's a challenge, and it's looking at YouTube and making sure that ads on YouTube are not going for that age group. I think we all have to have a holistic view of this. It's not only the industry that can solve all these problems. And we get accusations. We had one in the UK this week with somebody who's not a member of ours. They obviously have a license in the UK. We need to make sure that everyone is sitting by those standards. And when we have standards, that everyone will have to abide by them in the fullness of time. But it is work in progress, but I would certainly hope that we would move forward faster than this taking several years. I would certainly hope that sort of we will be making significant progress by the end of this year.
Well, I think there's the real challenge. I mean, you've mentioned that stat at the start, around 80% of I think, was it in stadium, or the advertising's gone down? But television. Television, sorry, absolutely. So how do you control the online? It's a whole different world out there. So I guess from what you've said there, are we saying that the only bit we can control is the content of what your operators put out there, or is there other stuff we can do?
No, I don't think so. I think we can work with the main platform providers to ensure. So we've got at the moment, we're looking at negative messages. What are the words, keywords like COVID-19 that should not be associated in any advertisement with gambling? And how do you get everyone to accept that list of keywords, and how do you share that list of keywords? So I think there's certainly work that can be done there. But there is work that the industry can do itself, and there's work that we can do. So we're going to have a proper advertising technology group that's going to be meeting to discuss these things. It's not only our members; it's a whole group of the wider world out there that has an interest in this. I think there's a lot we can do if we can work together, and actually, reputationally, it's not only the gambling industry that doesn't want to be associated with problems like this, it's also those wider social media platforms. I also think in the fullness of time, we need to have a licensing system for affiliates. So we can control through our members affiliates that they employ and how they behave. We need to make sure that those controls are also there for everybody.
Yeah, I think Richard, from your perspective, because I think Sky Bet, I can't remember whether you were still there at the time, were one of the first to try and look properly at the affiliate side. I think that's obviously a key area as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it came about because there was a couple of frankly pretty shocking episodes where at that point we had an affiliate program. There were thousands of affiliates that were essentially free to advertise our products with only limited controls on what they did, and it was a bit of a sort of whack-a-mole exercise for a number of years, and then there was a really shocking exercise, and we just decided that we just couldn't carry on having a broad affiliate program when we had the licensing responsibility for what they put out. So we shut the program down. I think, and there are a small number of when I left, there were a small number of advertising type partnerships still in existence, but not a broad program. And I think I agree with Brigid. I think companies have got to massively reduce the number of affiliates that they have and tightly control them, or some sort of licensing regime that puts the onus on the affiliates to behave responsibly. Otherwise, they'll lose their license. I think on the sort of advertising and social media point of view, I think online does offer great potential, because you can that advertising that appears in social media can be targeted or the opposite of targeted, prevented from being seen by certain individuals. So as age verification, potentially age gating, improves across social media platforms, and where people can self-exclude from and choose not to see any gambling ads, that is absolutely to the benefit of everyone. It's to the benefit of clearly the consumer or the person that doesn't want to see the ads, and to the benefit of the betting company, because we don't waste advertising money on those people that don't want to see those adverts, and it just helps the whole reputation of the industry and the social media platforms as well. So in a way, I think it's a hard problem technically, but it's a problem that everyone is incentivized to try and solve. So I'm personally pretty confident that we'll make good progress on that as an industry.
Do we think, because one of the first go-to actions from sort of the regulator seems to be banning advertising. I happen to be in Spain, and that certainly was one of the first things they worked. Sally, from a research perspective, does things like banning advertising work? Have we got any sort of guidance on that, or is it not something the industry's researched?
There is an increasing amount of research, increasing because there wasn't any. So there's a small amount of research now, but advertising is one of the really tricky things. So there's a few studies now on sort of qualitative or self-reports, and it's really notoriously unreliable. Everyone thinks they're not affected by advertising, but they're incredibly concerned that everyone else is. So it's not that much really credible evidence of the exact impact. And advertising works in a context of all the other things going on in someone's life. So for example, how do you tease apart the fact that they saw someone else gambling in the household? I think that the change that's happening at the moment is the isolation, that people are on their own in a period of potential stress. We know financial hardship is associated with at-risk gambling, and just recently at the University of Sydney, we've done a study looking at the fact that debt, stress and problem gambling are incredibly linked and intertwined. So we've got a lot of people in experience of financial hardship, experiencing psychological distress. It's a very distressing situation for everybody, really, for all different reasons. And gambling is a classic escapism. So where there is access to online gambling, where there's financial stress, where there's potentially more free time, there is a real risk that people will gamble in a harmful way in some sort of hope to either relieve their financial distress, which is often always really misguided, but entrenching these problems, and the long-term impact of these may last well beyond any actual shutdown period. So I think advertising is important to consider, but it's really not the whole picture. It's about looking at what are the other resources that are available for everyone at home in feelings of distress. Where are the mental health resources? Where are the ones that you can access remotely? What are the alternative activities that we can encourage? Or if people are going to gamble, how do we encourage people to do this at a sustainable level to really make people aware of the risks of long periods of gambling large amounts? So if you are going to gamble in an isolated online situation, how incredibly important things like setting yourself a limit or taking time outs, taking breaks, and making sure this isn't becoming a path to entrenching problems that are going to continue well into the future.
Brigid, I'll quickly come to you because a question come in around what work is underway. We're looking at how to filter advertising on social media, email, SMS, the technology platforms around children and vulnerable people being been excluded. So what if you just recover again, what sort of work's being done around that? And the other part of that question is this taking into account sort of experts by experience, back to Richard's comments earlier? So what work's being done around that? What can you tell us that the industry's doing?
And the work of the industry at the moment is being done by the industry, but it's being done with the social platforms. It is specifically looking at ensuring that no one who is under the age of 21 should be seeing advertisements for gambling. And I can't say that we've cracked that yet. There are technological as well as getting people to absolutely support what you're saying in that space. And of course, this is only with people who are regulated in the UK. We can't ensure that that we've had a problem, for example, that we have GamStop, which is the way you self-exclude. If you Google GamStop, you could see ways to find your way around it. How we deal with those sites is much more difficult, but we are working closely with the Gambling Commission. We've said to everybody, if you've got reports of people who are behaving improperly, then the Gambling Commission will take action to do something about it. But as we all know, technology is complicated, it's a world wide web. It's something that we are probably not going to crack entirely, but we're certainly doing a lot of work ourselves to see what more we can do.
Yeah, I think, Keith, come to you now. I think we're obviously very focused, obviously, on the online world, but online's relatively new to the US, although it's clearly where the future's going to be. What's the effect currently around the sort of land-based in the US? You mentioned earlier how many there actually are with casinos. What's the landscape like in the US when it comes to land-based?
Well, I think right now the majority of states have some form of land-based gambling. There's only 2 that have a prohibition on all gambling. And just like in response to the 2008 financial crisis, we are seeing already a number of bills mooted in state legislatures to expand gambling. Most of our states are going to try and gamble their way out of this economic crisis. And so we're looking at a vast ramp up of sports betting, online sports betting, and perhaps other forms of gambling in the states that don't already have them right now. And as the states expand, they compete with each other. So we saw 25 states, and after the 2008 financial crisis, either expand gambling or reduce regulation in order to compete with each other for gambling customers.
So I thought, I'm conscious of time. We could talk all day. We've only got 7 minutes left. Just really quickly, just to stick with you, Keith, because one of the points I wanted to bring up was around the approach. So you've got an operator that's global or a big brand that's partnered in the US, but they seem to take a very different approach when it comes to problem gambling. So are we seeing something like a very strong attention to detail and a plan around problem gambling that might be in Europe completely fall apart when it goes to the US with less stringent regulators or a different approach to it? How are we seeing that in the US?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that global best practices are not really used by operators. They tend to dumb down their responsible gambling to what's required within any given jurisdiction. And we see this not just with global companies, the difference between the UK and US operations, but even within states. So the same company, with very few exceptions, most of our companies have state-specific strategies, those that operate in multiple states, and they tend to dumb down their responsible gambling to just what's required in each particular state they operate in. And it's getting better, but probably still the majority of our companies tend to default to the lowest common denominator. And as we said earlier, that means the whole industry has defaulted down to the lowest common denominator. And until that starts to change, it's very difficult to talk about progress we're making with individual companies and individual states, but not at all nationwide. We're industry-wide.
And I think that's really interesting. It probably brings us nicely to one of the last topics we'll have time to cover. Do we think the regulators are able to cope with both the technology changes and certainly the challenges around problem gambling, especially when the UK are talking about, say, reducing the members of staff we've got out? And I appreciate it's difficult, but Rich, I'll come to your perspective. From a regulator's point of view, what do you think they need to do to keep abreast of the situation? Are they handling it well at the moment? What's your views?
I think that the work that they produce and the sort of direction of travel that they go in, I think is the right approach and is reasonable. Do think that they are, that they do seem to be a little under-resourced. I'm not quite sure where that staff reduction came from, and I do think that they need a strong and effective and up to speed regulator, and I'm not sure that they've always been that over the last 5 years, and I think that they need to be properly resourced going forward. So I think it's a bit like we had a regulatory action against us. We had a fine. It was an incredibly difficult time, and I think it's very painful to be in that moment. And it's very easy to it's a bit like the referee. We get a yellow card or a red card and think it's unfair. Well, I don't think it was in that case, but I think we've all got to recognise that for the industry to survive and potentially thrive, we need a really strong regulator that reduces the incidence of harm in the country. So I think we need a stronger, better resourced regulator.
Yeah, I think. Would you concur with that, Brigid? What's your thoughts? Because the Gambling Commission here in the UK are getting a lot of flack at the moment. What's your thoughts about your dealings with them?
I'm very keen that we work very closely with the regulator. I think up until the advent of the Betting and Gaming Council, they had really no choice but to go to individual companies. Now I hope we're developing a better relationship. So when there are requests and they want information, that they'll work with us and we will ensure that our members actually provide that information with suitable confidentiality clauses that make that work. So, if you've got a regulator as an industry, you've got to work closely with them. There's got to be help on both sides. We've got a strong government as well that's interested in us as an industry. And between us, the government and the Gambling Commission, we need to make it work. They can't be seen to be too close to industry, and they're absolutely not. And they are, as Richard said, in putting in place fines where they see that's appropriate. But I do think that there are areas where we can provide them with information, they can provide us with information, and we can work better together.
All right, so the last point, because we're about out of time, so I'll leave it with a poll that I've just put up with it, which says, sports betting will eventually resume and some sort of normality will return. In the short term, as that happens, there's this expectation that a lot of people will immediately come back to the fold, for want of a better expression. Do you think the industry needs to put in special measures to handle the expected influx? Richard, I'll come to you first. Do you think there's anything we need to do?
So just to make sure I understand the question, so this is when sports comes back and there's an influx in gambling, do we need measures then or do we need measures now?
Yeah, well, I guess you put them in now. I think what the point is that, the Premier League kicks off on a certain date. We're expecting everybody to come running back and bets to go mad, everything else. Do you think, if we do, firstly, do you think that's going to happen? And secondly, would we need to put special measures in ahead of that to protect?
I have no insight into whether it's going to happen or not. I do think that, in the current, overall gambling has gone down in the UK. I do think, as Sally stressed earlier on, that there is vulnerable individuals, and potentially a broad range of people are at risk of addiction issues and problem behaviour issues, including gambling. And I think there's a high risk at the moment, and therefore there should be more measures in place along the lines of the BGC's commitment. I'd like to see, hopefully beneath that, certainly on an operator by operator level, there should be details behind that, and as was asked, the question was asked, measurement of it. But I think that principle of heightened engagement with customers at this time is the right one. And if football came back, there'd probably be another good time to raise those measures.
I'll totally leave the last word to Sally just on that one. I'm not sure there is a right answer to it, but its research point of view, we're expecting loads of people to come back to this. Do we see any sort of evidence-based approach that people have dropped off and will come back with a big bang and then continue to bet more? Is there anything from history will tell us that?
If we look at the economic issues, we see from previous recessions, including research done on the big Icelandic banking situation several years ago, that when the recession's going on, there's huge economic impacts. There is a change to gambling. Lotteries usually go up and other forms of gambling go down. It's interesting to see what will happen with land-based, particularly with people who have been very heavy or even potentially problematic gamblers. Self-exclusion, where forced barring from venues, is used as a way to help people overcome their gambling, particularly if it's used combined with some sort of proactive efforts. And we have seen just naturalistically things like smoking bans have an increased impact on gambling. So it'll be interesting to see, and we're conducting research to look at what is the impact of this ban. For some people, this will be a naturalistic break, depending on how long it lasts for, that they'll find other activities and get out of the habit. They'll, have transferred over to something else, whether that be online gambling or it might be something other than gambling completely. For others, there is this sort of urgency that will continue to build up, and people will go back to it. But we really have to look at this with interest, because the shutdown is having such a huge impact on people's lives. People's whole lives potentially are changing depending on how long this happens, with many, many different ways. So I don't think we can assume things will go right back to usual as the situation was before.
I think that comes back. There was a question came in around, is this the perfect time to put the limits in ahead of that? But I think, look, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank all four of you for coming on. It's been great. Genuinely could have gone on for another hour. And I haven't even got through half the points we have sent out to talk about. I'd certainly like to thank everybody who came on. There was a load of questions we simply haven't had a time to get round to. I'll see if there's any we can sort of publish with answers on around that. Feel free to join us next week for the next one. But I think certainly for everybody who's been on, it's been great. I've loved it. Appreciate the time. We can all get back to lockdown, and I'll hopefully speak to you all soon. Take care, guys. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Yep. I guess.